Welcome to HortTube. We're going to jump right back in and keep covering plants in this extended tour video of all the plants in the garden here in Raleigh, North Carolina. One of the salvias that we've used the most over the last few years has been the Summer Jewels series of salvia. Most of them are fairly muted pinks. They're either white, muted pinks, or muted kind of lavender colors. They're not particularly super showy in the garden. They do have a tremendous amount of pollinators around them. And we're talking about native bees, honey bees, all kinds of little flying insects that you would not normally see. You know, we don't normally think about as pollinators, but just supporting a tremendous amount of life. And I can see it this morning. All these really small flying creatures are around this one. But this is Summer Jewels Red salvia, and we did this one from seed. We bought one or two last year, and they were just one of the bigger performers here in the garden. We don't use a whole lot of red in the garden, so we just put these together. And again, most of the time we're not thinking about these as being showy, but this Summer Jewels Red is definitely very different from that. It is incredibly showy. Pollinators just absolutely crazy for it. I don't know how much that camera will pick up all the small flying things around these this morning. On these, maintenance-wise, on our salvias, pretty much throughout the entire garden, they'll occasionally get a little bit of a haircut, but we won't do them all at one time because we don't want to take them all away from the pollinators. But as you're watching the series of videos, you're going to see a lot of salvia, a whole lot of salvia. So we can come in here and take about a third of them, take about a third of them, about a third down, and they'll just flush right back out and start blooming again. The other option is to just deadhead them individually. So we can take each stem as they finish blooming and do them individually. Steph has the patience for that. Jim does not have the patience for that. So if it's me, I'm going to just do off with their heads, and I'll take this material and I'll actually just mulch the plant with it, or I'll throw it up under another plant, that kind of thing. But that's the Summer Jewels Red, one of the top performers here in the garden. And all these Summer Jewels salvias are available from seed. They're easy from seed. So there you go. The Lantana that's next to it is eating the world, and it's going to have some control after this series of videos. So we've been waiting to shoot this series of videos before we added some control out here in the garden. These are going to need to probably be taken back at least a third. They're laying on several different things that you'll see in a second. This particular variety is called Chapel Hill Miss Huff, which is weird. We don't know where this name came from for this one. Miss Huff has a little more orange in it, and there's a Chapel Hill yellow. And I don't know if these are a mix of the two or why somebody named it with those two names together. But it's been very hardy for us, and there's a limited number of the Lantanas that are actually hardy for us. You know, we're in zone 8A, 7B-ish. We were in 7B before the map change. So some Lantanas are and some Lantanas aren't hardy here, whereas down in Florida in zone 9, they're all hardy, and not only are they hardy, some of them are quite invasive. So here we have winter as a control. But once established, these things develop these crazy root systems on them, and when they come out of the ground, this thing wakes up late, later than other perennials, but once it wakes up, it can become a 4x4 mass. This is probably the best plant in the garden for butterflies. So as you know, if we're looking at butterflies visiting the garden, it's probably the Lantana is right at the top of their list, although we've given them the option of lots and lots of things out here, and butterfly bushes would be on that list as well, but Lantana is probably at the top of it. There's lots of things for them, but for some reason, the Lantana is always number one. And no matter where you live in the country, Lantana is worth growing, you know, as an annual, you know, in northern areas. Up above that, we have the Amelanchier or serviceberry. It's a single trunk serviceberry, where you'll see most of the serviceberries are going to be multi-trunk. Great fall color on it, flowers in the spring, produces a fruit that, if you can get the fruit, is incredibly flavorful. And Steph didn't believe me that they were better than blueberries because she had never tasted them. And we were over in Charlotte, and there was a row of trees that didn't have any disease issues on them, and she got to try them, and then I couldn't get her out of the area for a while. We were eating handfuls of them, and then other people didn't realize they were edible, and they started eating them. But ours has cedar apple rust, and that cedar apple rust it gets on the actual fruit. and damages the fruit. And it's also caused a little bit of dieback on a few branches, like the last 6 inches of growth on a few branches up there. I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but there's a few brown leaves up there that no big deal overall. The tree still is healthy. I'm not really going to worry about it. It's just not something I'm just not going to deal with it. I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I'm not worried about it. I do, though, this winter need to go up there and take a few crossing branches out. There's a few branches that are heading in toward the middle. I've got a really good base down here at the bottom of spreading branches. So I've got where it's about 6 feet tall where it branches, which is good for a tree if you can have that. If you have a single trunk tree, I don't want branching below 6 feet because, you know, the limbs will end up in people's faces. But then once those go out, I want the branches coming off of those branches to also go out. So it creates an open habit. But instead, I have some coming right back into the center. Those will get cut off when it's dormant during the wintertime. There are a couple of conifers along the edge. One of them is needing to be rescued from the lantana, and this is what I'm talking about. As we got to get some control added to this bed in particular. I think as we go along, there'll be less maintenance. But this one, from the first video, I need to prune some Clayera and several other things, and then this lantana's gotten out of control over here. But wanted to kind of show that, you know, during the summertime, you need to be out here thinking about protecting some of your plants. But this Pinus nigra, this Austrian pine, is called Oregon green. It will ultimately outgrow this space. It can get over 10 feet in height in time. And it has these beautiful candles on it. Once it really roots in and starts to put on some growth, it has these really beautiful upright candles on it. Hasn't really grown that much here. It's going to be heat stressed in our area. We're on the very southern edge of where one of these Austrian pines actually wants to grow, like zone 4 to 8 or something like that. So we've got the roots protected on it. There's a delicate balance between, and we'll see this on another conifer at the last thing in this video today, where there's a delicate balance with these conifers that don't want all the heat, that you need to protect the roots, but then we don't want anything laying on it either. So, you know, we've got to get that cut back. It does still need the sun. Then right here is a juniper. This juniper is called Golden Joy. This is one of the many Isley conifers that are out here in the garden. Perfect plant for this spot. You won't be able to tell from the video. This actually gains about 2 feet in elevation, and very difficult to find things to grow on it. Now things are pretty established and it looks like it was easy, but initially it always took more water along this edge because the water just it soaks in everywhere up there, and then any water that gets near this driveway edge just falls right down to the driveway. So juniper's the perfect plant for that. They're cold tolerant, heat tolerant, drought tolerant, wind tolerant, you know, all those kinds of things, you know, pretty much across the board with different types of different species of junipers even. But this one's called Golden Joy. It could get 3 or 4 feet tall and 8 feet wide if we let it, but we can keep it whatever size we want. I think it'll be nice to have it just come out just a bit, you know, over the driveway like this and a little bit further up in there. And again, we're gonna tame this lantana in the next couple of days, just waiting for this video to pass because I wanna show some of the issues in the garden that develop over the summer, things that we're thinking about and things that we need to do in this video series. We're gonna have several native plants in a row coming up in this section. We have, and I think I said 372 species, but it's actually 327 on my rough count. And I know there's a lot more than that, but that was just going through. And then probably close to 900 plants. Some of them are the same species with different cultivar names, that kind of thing. But we do have a lot of natives out here, and a whole lot of natives. And one of our great natives, or one of our great native shrubs, is clethra. This is Clethra anifolia, and this variety is called ruby spice, which is very common out in the trade. Gets quite big in time. It can colonize. You know, a lot of our native shrubs can colonize. I'll say that a few times over these series of videos that, you know, you have to, you know, our native shrubs are very good at taking space in the garden. What's great about this particular native shrub? Number one, Steph and I have seen these out in the wild. They typically are got their feet in water in moist places. So you'll see them on the flood lines of lakes and rivers and streams where they're like, if there's a bank that comes up and then there's a slight dip next to it, That's the kind of places these like. So it's moist, it's consistently moist. We cut them in the driest space in the garden though. So a lot of these plants that we'll see in the wild, Itea is another example of that. We only ever see it in the wild in the water, but then somehow they translate to our really dry, tough situations in our gardens as well. This thing is probably visited, I don't know how many different species of flying creatures visit these, but it's wild. We'll get the big, of course, native bumblebees on it, but then we get all of these other flying wasps and flies and interesting things that pollinate the clethra. Again, this is ruby spice, and then we have a white one here that wasn't meant to be white called hummingbird, and it has fallen over from the rain that we've gotten. One thing I'd show you here, look at the back of this leaf on this. This is an example of a leaf not getting any sunlight on it, and then when it bent over, the sunlight got on the back of the leaves and burned them. So you got to be careful. I'm talking about pruning a few things. We do have to be careful though, you know, when we're thinking about pruning something. If you prune something too hard, you get down into leaves that haven't seen direct sun, and then they burn very easily. So we're cautious with that. I'm not worried about lantana. Lantana won't care about hard pruning, but some things in your garden will. Not only will you cut the the growth off of it, you'll then burn everything that's left on it. But clethra, amongst the top pollinator plants out here in the garden. These need some control, but I'll warn you that there's really not a great time to prune these. This is another one of those plants, and we'll point this out on a few things in the garden. A hard pruning of this will cost us a season of flowers. We'll get some flowers, but if I took this and said after it finishes blooming, I'm gonna cut it to the ground, or after it finishes producing seed, because the seed's valuable too. If I cut this to the ground, two things are gonna happen. One is it's gonna sucker like crazy, and I mean truly colonize. When I cut the top on it, it's gonna go crazy. The other thing that's gonna happen is that it's gonna take 2 seasons to get back up and be in full bloom like this again. So it's one of these plants I would recommend. I would caution you to make sure that you have enough space for it when you plant it so that you can allow it to get tall. The best looking clethra in our neighborhood, there's a neighbor down here that has maybe 6 or 8 varieties, and they just have them in a large space where they don't ever have to hack on them like we will here. We've used this raspberry ripple Zenia for several years in a row now. It's just one of the top performers. We do a lot of the dwarf zinnias out here in the garden. You know, the taller growing zinnias that people use for cut flowers and that kind of thing. You know, although there are some series that are less likely to get powdery mildew, the vast majority of them here in the South, regardless, at some point will get powdery mildew, and they're kind of short. If I do the tall zinnias, I feel like I have to do them twice in a year. You know, they're gonna burn out by the middle of summer here in Raleigh, and then we could redo them. But the dwarf, you know, the smaller growing ones that we can do from seed, this is again double raspberry ripple, and double hot cherry is the darker one. And so Steph did this combo of these two this year, and it just looks really great. There is an Asiatic lily that has finished blooming right here, but I'll put up a photo that I took with my phone that happened to be the same color combination as these two. Sometimes you get a little bit of a little bit of luck involved. Rabbits have worked on this thing, and that's why there's only one piece. This is a spot that the rabbits really like to chew on things. This Liatris is an example of that, where they've eaten this down to the ground, but it still has managed to flower. And what we have found on the Liatris is the first year or two, the rabbits will eat them and eat them and eat them, but they don't kill them. And about the 3rd year, they outpace the ability for the rabbits to actually do damage to them, and they're quite big. And we have an example of that in the garden. Another great native pollinator plant that's out here. There is one melonpodium that I'll point out here, and we'll have a few more in the back garden, but the yellow flowers back there, those are melonpodium that came back from seed. They are, be careful what you wish for with a melonpodium. They're great. They're absolutely great annual plants, but they will seed themselves in time. This dwarf redbud has limited availability, but it was one of the plants that everybody wanted to know about at the open house. This is an incredible dwarf purple redbud, and you can see how the leaves are dwarf on it. I would imagine, you know, despite the fact that I'm saying it's dwarf, it's fairly vigorous growth, got some very vigorous growth on it. And so I think it's still going to become a decent size, it's a small ornamental tree, but I think it's going to become decent sized in time. I'll limit up a bit and get it up above these things in time if it does start to get that kind of height on it. But you got the beautiful purple foliage. It bloomed fairly well. It's a young plant, but it actually had more flowers on it than our Golden Falls redbud that you'll see in one of these future videos. So it was kind of interesting. I thought these dwarf redbuds would just not bloom as much, but they did pretty well. We had them planted in the vegetable garden for the winter, just storing them, and then they found a home. And I say they, because this is the purple foliage version of it, and we have the green foliage version in the ground as well that we'll see in another video. Looking back to make sure I hit everything that was back this direction. If I didn't name this redbud, it's Amethyst is the name of this one. The green one is called Emerald, is that right? Emerald and Amethyst. And I think there's more coming as well on these dwarf redbuds. Really interesting plants for those of you who are looking for some sort of small ornamental tree. These are going to be just like any other redbud. They're not going to be particularly fond of being out in the absolute full sun. So these annuals being planted around its roots is probably ideal. Next to it and crowding it a bit, I need to get in here and do a little bit of pruning on this calicarpa. This is a white berrying calicarpa that we got from Buddy Lee. Buddy Lee's the inventor of Encore azaleas. I think there was in the first video that Moon Dance hydrangea paniculata that was so full and compact, tight. That's also one of Buddy's, from Buddy's breeding program down in Louisiana. I visited him last week down there, and it's always amazing. He can work on so many projects at one time, including, I think there were, like 25,000 azaleas he was evaluating in 1 gallon containers. It's really wild. But anyway, this is a white bearing calicarpa. We'll get the flowers on them now as the stems extend, and then the berries form up the branch as they go, and then they turn white later in the summer. And then at some point, they either ferment or we get a cool night on them, they get a slight frost on them, and then the birds come and take them all at once. But it's so strange because they don't take a one, there's not a bird on it, they don't seem interested in it, and then one day, when they hit some sort of maturity, that fruit hits some sort of maturity level, they just strip them bare. And there's so many birds on it that they're weighting the branches down to the ground. So again, this is a white berrying version of our native Calicarpa americana. So there's, several native plants right here in a row. And then over to a clematis. This one's called Dr. Rupel. It still has a couple flowers on it right now. I'm really bad, and I always have been, with clematis in the spring. When they put on that, they're capable of putting on 6 or 8 feet of growth right out of the gate in the early spring, and I just don't monitor it very well, and they just end up in a pile. that's my clematis growing. I could have had this thing going down the fence, probably 6 feet behind the Calicarpa and blooming on the front of the fence, and it'll grow that fast if you'll keep feeding it through stuff. But all of my clematis always end in a pile. And it was the same way at the nursery. It was the same way at my old house. It's just, just my style for clematis is clematis. It's attached to something, but it's kind of in a pile. This one, Dr. Rupel, blooms and blooms. It bloomed out heavily, was completely covered in flowers back in April. Did a little bit of deadheading on them. So you can take these spent flowers off. That will produce a little bit more growth, and those will end in a few additional flowers throughout the summer. If you watched the first video, you know how many of these annual vinca we use. This one's called Tattoo Blueberry. There were more of them in the first video, but we'll take these annual vinca, some of them we do from seed, some of them we buy, and just plug them into gaps in the garden. And I consider a lot of these annuals as placeholders. So if we find a shrub or a small conifer or a ground cover or something like that in the future, that's a spot you know, that it can go. But for now, you know, I enjoy plugging these annuals in. The vinca's not the best thing for the pollinators, but again, we've got so many pollinator plants you're gonna see over the series of videos. It's kind of wild. There's a candy tuft here and it blooms like crazy in the earlier part of the season. Took a couple seasons. This area out here by the road, we're gonna do along this fence in the next video, but this area along the road is a tough area. We did not amend this soil as much, and we've got some native perennials in here, agave. We've put in some tougher things that you'll see. So this is kind of where things have to be pretty tough to survive this space out here by the road. And it took this candy tuft 2 seasons for it to really dig in and start to grow. And now it's, you know, it'll bloom like crazy this next winter. There are some alliums here, ping pong allium. We leave the alliums up in the garden because they actually remain kind of decorative. Not this one so much. Again, this one's kind of a tough love area. It's caught up in this clematis, so I can't get it. But in another video, you're gonna see some alliums which look great in the garden with spent flowers. This one is not an example of that. But this one has survived a couple seasons now, so I think next year it'll probably be better than it has been. But again, this is the tough love area of the garden. This cone flower is called Cheyenne Spirit. This is a seedling of it. So, you know, it was planted back here, very, very vigorous one. Again, in this unamended native soil out here, our cone flowers go wacky. This one's a tall growing one regardless, but it's amazing to me how much better some of our native perennials do out here in this kind of it didn't have a lot of compost and stuff added to it. This is a seedling of it. They take about a year in this, you know, like this without any flowers, you know, pretty big leaves on them. Next year, you know, have flower spikes this tall, just like the ones next to it. One thing I'd like to point out, again, with our native plants, they love it out here. And here's this American beautyberry that's behind it. You can see all the seedlings that are coming up from it from last year. So the seed that the birds don't get are, they all germinate. And so we're pulling these up in the garden, and you're gonna see that, you know, I can say, here, I mean, here's another native, you know, seedling. The rubies to the clethra over there spreading. You know, our native plants, they're pretty good if you keep the invasives away from them and keep them weeded and mulch them. Boy, they'll really thrive. They'll really thrive in your gardens. This is another vinca that was in that first video as well. This one is Cora Cascade Apricot, and it's a spreading vinca. So it'll just come down over this curb in time. It's a cool one just to plug in under some things and let it just kind of crawl out, which you can see how it's done. This cone flower was not actually up when this was planted here, you know, or maybe it was just, you know, like this tall. And so didn't necessarily know it was going to overlap the vinca, but it works out just fine because it's a vinca that's capable of crawling out from under it and getting to the sun, and it looks pretty cool like that. There's an arborvitae here that we transplanted out here that had been in a container for a couple of years. I actually need to, I don't know why it settled. It settled to the left a bit. I've got to pull those beauty berries from around it pretty quick before it eats it. But what we do on most of our dwarf conifers, this one's called Primo, the very small growing, slow growing arborvitae. What we'll do on these is put them in a container for a season or two. And then we'll plant them into the ground, and that slows the whole process down. We know a lot of these, you know, dwarf conifers or any of these conifers in the garden, dwarf or not, they don't have off switches. They're gonna outgrow any space we put them in, but we can enjoy them for a lot of years. 2 years in a container, and that's as big as this thing is. Probably 6 or 7 years here in this spot before I have to think about that it's gonna be too big at some point in the future. It's another one of the Isley conifers that are in the garden, and I need to take a shovel, and it was straight up and down when I planted it. I don't know why it settled a bit. I may not have packed the soil down around it. I may have been in too big of a hurry, whatever. I have no idea. But I'll wait. I'm not gonna do it on a 101-degree day for sure. I'll wait until fall, and I'll stick a shovel up under this side of it and put some soil down in there, and it'll stand it right back up. It's not a thing I need to panic about. I just don't wanna do it on a 100-degree day. I'll do it in a cool fall day. So there's this side of this middle bed, as you can see from the drone, you know, about where we are here in the garden. This To my right, the sun is coming up right now. We're shooting this early in the morning, and this space will be in the sun until 3:30, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It absolutely cooks out here. The fence, as the sun gets to about 2 o'clock, something like that, the fence will start to put a shadow down on about half of this bed. So something like this conifer that's really, we're a little too hot in our area for, will get a little bit of shade on its roots at that point. So it's a little protected halfway back right there. But for the first 2/3 of the day, it is just gonna absolutely cook out here by the road. So thank you guys so much for following along. And from here, we're just gonna go up the street and show you some kind of tough plants that actually get a lot of tough love. We don't really, if we're watering things and we're in a hurry, this is the area in this next video that gets very little attention. Thanks for watching.